Hi, welcome everybody to one of our quarterly forums here with the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council. Our forum today is going to be on habitat connectivity, and we have a couple of presenters. First up will be Andy Magi with our Scappoose Watershed Council. He's our board president, and he also is a senior associate at Pew Charitable Trust as well. And he will be going over habitat connectivity generally. And then we also then have Jason Smith, who is the Habitat Restoration Project Manager at the Columbia River Estuary Study Taskforce, or CREST. Um, we'll have several speakers. We're in for a real treat tonight. So without further ado, I'll let Andy go ahead and introduce himself and get started.
Hi, thanks, Rochelle. Can everyone see my presentation screen and not like a tab, like a screen with like a million tabs? I just want to make sure. Okay, so real quick as way of introduction, I kind of have two roles that I'll talk briefly about tonight. The first is I am the president of the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council. So I'm really excited that everyone's here this evening on one of our education forums. I'm really excited to get to hear more about the project that took place in our watershed. And I'm really excited that we have the folks from CREST and ODFW here tonight to talk about that. Why am I, aside from saying how excited I am to be here, what else am I doing here tonight? So in my day job, as Rochelle introduced, I am a senior principal associate at Pew Charitable Trust, and one of our largest work portfolios in the U.S. Conservation Program is work on wildlife connectivity. I personally work on wildlife connectivity in California and Oregon and other places in the West. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight, sort of in this dual role as president of the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council, but also as someone who works on the daily on promoting policies and supporting getting projects going across the West on wildlife connectivity. Try to just put this in context. Like, why does wildlife connectivity matter? Why is the Watershed Council talking about it? And then what role does the Watershed Council play in wildlife connectivity? So I just want to kind of provide that larger context and then dig really a little bit deeper into the specific project that we're talking about here with CREST tonight. So we'll have time for questions if people do, and it could be the other panelists, it could be those of you that are on this that want to ask more questions about wildlife connectivity broadly. But yeah, that's what we're all about today. So just real quickly, just what are we talking about when we talk about wildlife connectivity? Let's see if does my screen in fact move. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. Real simply, it's the ability for animals to move freely across landscapes. I think a lot of times when we hear people talk about wildlife connectivity, the first thing that they think about are the big migrations of like ungulates that take place across ecosystems across the world. It might be mule deer in Oregon. It might be some animals across plains in Africa. Or other large migrations. It might be bird migrations is like really comes up across a lot, but a lot of different kinds of animals do in fact move across landscapes between different ranges as part of their life cycles. And those movements need to be supported for a number of reasons. They provide not only benefits for our ecosystem, but they provide benefits for our communities. And just a few most people, I didn't put a picture of one of the big ungulates up here because, to kind of make that point when we talk about connectivity, when we talk about wildlife movement, it is creatures great and small. So the picture of okay, I just got a note. My presentation is not on the screen. Let me see what's going on here. How about now, Rochelle?
No, yes.
There we
Oh,
go.
it was. There we go. Is it now?
Yep.
It is. It's not the full screen though.
Okay.
There, it's full screen.
There it's
now.
full screen. Okay, great. So the question, and I will also say this, that we know that removing barriers from connectivity brings animals back and helps connect them to their traditional habitats and ecosystems. So this very first picture, this is to me in my day-to-day, one of the biggest examples. This is a salmon returning to the Klamath River. This literally happened. This is the last month this year they spent taking those big 3 dams out of the Klamath River, and salmon are already returning to their formal territories. Great example of success. We have a smaller cement passageway under a road to help move animals like coyotes and wolves, big cats, things like that. And then here at the bottom of the screen, this is the Northwest salamander. They got to move too. They move from vernal pools, places that they lay their eggs, to habitats across roads and things like that. So again, creatures great and small all have to move. So there are a number of threats to wildlife connectivity and preventing these migrations from happening safely. One of the first is habitat fragmentation. So these is like, you might look up on a hillside near your house, and you might see sort of pockets of clear cuts in a forest, and then sort of in the center of those clear cuts, there might be a remaining stand for some reason. That's habitat fragmentation. That's taking habitat and creating islands out of it, like large intact habitats, and creating islands out of it. It can also be putting dams and streams, culverts. It can also be, things, bigger, the sort of things we think about. Roads can create fragmentation as well, which brings us to the next point. Human infrastructure is a very large impediment to animal migration. And this is sort of the traditional things, you put a big road or highway, you're going to increase animal vehicle collisions, right? You put a culvert that's like too small for the stream, fish are not going to be able to pass through, right? And it might be, and there might not be a plan for that. Climate change is another big impact on wildlife migration. Presumably animals a lot of times are moving from range to range. As those ranges shift, as those habitats in between shift because of climate change, so do the corridors that animals rely on shift. And so that creates a lot of change. It creates fragmentation. And then land use changes. Sometimes this can get lumped into habitat fragmentation, but this is how we develop our communities. Where do we put subdivisions? Where do we put business parks, right? Are we going to change land use in a way that takes it from being more or less managed for its natural values to maybe like there's, this happens in other states a lot. It does happen in Oregon, but maybe there's a lithium mine in Nevada that needs to be built. And so they're going to take and they're going to fence off a large area that may have been naturally maintained to help develop lithium or other energy projects. So land use changes can do that too. Okay, so that's like what it is. Those are what the threats are. Why do we want to talk about this? And I think there's a lot of reasons that I just want to go through real quick. One, there's a huge public safety component to thinking about through a wildlife connectivity. One, when we correct connectivity, when we think about supporting corridors, creating passages, it reduces wildlife and vehicle collisions and enhances safety. And this is in every state, every example that we have, and the numbers are somewhere between like 80 to 90% improvement in collisions where some sort of passage has been created. And that's sort of like really typically the first level of prioritization when states are going through planning. Where are the heat maps pointing to these interactions between humans and animals happening? And it's unsafe for both. Just to put some numbers on it, along with that 85 to 90% improvement, it was something like there were 25,000 animal-human collisions last year that cost, if you add up vehicle repairs, if you add up hospital bills, it was something like $8 billion across the United States that was having to be spent on fixing cars and fixing the people that got hurt. And that's not to like overlook the fact that like of those 25,000, I think there were like a few hundred deaths that were included on that. So like this is like just big number one. It is safer when we are creating passages. It is safer for animals. It's safer for humans. It also supports rural economies and recreation. So this is like another really important thing. Sportsmen, these large herds that move across territories, hunting, seasonal patterns, things like that. So people go to rural areas to engage with animals, both around recreation and viewing, but also around like hunting and fishing and things like that. So those are all things those are huge economic drivers. Outdoor recreation in the United States is like a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it is like a billion-dollar industry in most states in the West. So it's not small potatoes. So when you help support animal populations and give them thriving ecosystems to live in, you are also supporting economies, especially in rural parts of the country and the state. Okay, so probably what a lot of people are on this phone to hear about, big one, preserves biodiversity and healthy ecosystems. The more that animals can move through ranges and ecosystems, the more biodiversity we simply have, right? The more animals that are moving, the more animals that have space to roam. We're supporting their populations. There is also some research in terms of genetic diversity within animal populations, if you really want to get like really down into the weeds on biodiversity and things like that, right? So it creates healthier populations of individual animals while supporting a diverse range of ecosystems that therefore support a wide range of animals and species. And then finally, a big reason, one that we're talking more and more about, and you are hearing more and more about, it's climate resilience and adaptation. So on the animal side, as climate change continues to shape our landscapes, wildlife migrations are going to change, right? And they'll change dependent on species, they'll change dependent on ecosystems, but where animals are moving now will likely change depending on those specific changes in those areas, right? So like you might have a well-established corridor for, let's say, mule deer, but in the future, their ranges might change because food source is changing, because landscape is changing, et cetera, water availability is changing. So they might move what those patterns are. So the more that we're protecting corridors and the more we're doing it with sort of like a climate adaptation lens, we can help better support animal populations into the future. But also when we are like restoring, let's say like a lot for the Watershed Council, again, how does this matter for us? When you are restoring a stream and you're, making that stream function better, you're increasing the health of the riparian environment, you're also like reconnecting animal species to cold water refugia, you're creating more plant diversity that creates more forage for animals, right? So like these projects that might be about connection and reconnection are also just helping bolster the ecosystem generally, which builds resilience to climate change in the future. So those are like why. That's like the big why. There's a lot of reasons to care about this stuff, and there's a lot of data and numbers and science that supports that. And maybe one day when we do another one of these, we'll just have a data dump. I'll just put all the research and stuff that's up on the screen. That's really what we like to talk about. We like to talk about the data. So anyway, the good news is things are happening on connectivity across the country. Obviously, the West is the hot spot for this, but it's happening in like every state. Last year, there were 18. Over the last year, there's been 18 federal laws, or not federal laws, but laws in states passed to support wildlife connectivity in some way, shape, or form. Many of those have included funding for projects or funding to support projects or planning. In Oregon in the last legislative session, I think around highways received about $5 million to help support that work. Watershed councils receive funding through OWEB, and that is supported through state government and the budget process. But when you look at the list of states that this has been happening in, Utah, Nevada, California, Oregon, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming, It's happening in states that are diverse politically, right? So this is an issue that in my day-to-day, and I think the day-to-day of a lot of people who work on this, we find broad support. Like, this isn't just a environmental conservationist issue. This is a sportsman issue. This is a public safety issue. This is a transportation issue. And so it is an issue that support really lives across a broad spectrum of people and political affiliation. So there's good news. I think that's like just the other thing here that I want to say. This is like wildlife connectivity is kind of like a good news kind of thing. And this is leaving out a conversation about like what has been happening at the federal level around wildlife connectivity, which has been quite a bit, to help support that through a number of planning processes and rules and all the things that the federal government does. I just wanted to briefly touch on a few things, but I know that we have some people from CREST and ODFW here. So there's a lot going on in Oregon. I think if you really want to dig into this, the Oregon Wildlife Connectivity Implementation Plan is really important. I like to play a lot with OCAMP, the Oregon Connectivity Assessment Project, and then looking at sort of how they're using that to create priority wildlife connectivity areas. That was actually a project that Pew helped support. I was not part of that work, but that is a Pew supported project, getting that mapping off the ground and supported. And then on the aquatic side, OWEB, ODFW, and the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council, we're constantly looking at connectivity and what barriers exist, and then working with those partners on assessment and planning and funding for projects that will help create those. And just to give you a little snapshot of that, at the watershed level and the aquatic level, again, we've never done a crossing, right? Like a wildlife crossing, in the sense, thinking about like deer, mountain lions, or something like that. But like our bread and butter is an aquatic connectivity at the watershed level. And so in 2001, Scappoose Bay Watershed Council conducted the first fish passage barrier assessment in our watershed. We found 131 barriers. On 107 of them, were prioritized to do like further assessment and evaluation on what projects might look like on those. Over the last 20 years, we've removed 50 of those barriers, and most of the 50 projects were sort of the highest priority projects that we identified. And again, that's not just looking at like what does the Watershed Council think is important. It's also what like ODFW has some insight into that. Other agencies help us do that. And of those, I think there's only like maybe 6 that were of the highest priority value that have not been corrected. And so when we think about future work, really committed to identifying what additional barriers can and need to be removed. What are those high value ones that for whatever reason have not been? We're also looking more at not just sort of your connecting, top down connection. So like when we like thinking more about barriers, we're also thinking about more fully reconnecting streams to things like floodplains and side channels, and just really help increase access to habitat for fish and other aquatic species. And then how are we using climate assessments to make decisions about which of these barriers and which projects around connectivity are the right ones to pursue. That's like a whole conversation in and of itself, but it all has to do with cold water and cold water refugia, sort of the name of the game. So how are we making sure that fish and aquatic species have access to those cold water habitats that we can protect well into the future? I did want to leave you just with one thing that I actually spend a lot of time thinking about. Some of the projects that we have are really built around not just helping projects get done, or thinking about how states plan projects and what policies and funding sources can help support those. But a really big component to what we do is like, are we doing connectivity in a way that supports both terrestrial and aquatic species? And one of the things I spend a lot of time talking about is culverts. Whether that's at the Watershed Council or at Pew, I spend a lot of time talking about culverts. And one of the things that we're really working on is looking at places and opportunities to bring design standards online that say, if you are, let's say, fixing a undersized culvert that happens to be under a road that also has elk passing over it routinely, and creating those issues that we talked about earlier, let's build a culvert that then also has some area along the side of the stream and is big enough for ungulates or big cats or other species to utilize as part of their corridor and passages. So this is like, for me, it's kind of neat because, you know, I spend my time volunteering and thinking a lot about aquatic connectivity with the watershed. But you know, in my day job, I think a lot more probably about terrestrial connectivity. And so culverts are the place where those two passions are like really coming together and kind of thinking about a future where, when we're doing these projects, how are we supporting multi-species passage through those systems? And you can see a couple different design options here, right? But the idea is take advantage of those opportunities, because you're probably not going to get to rip the road up like twice, you know, so try to do it once. And that's kind of like the context, right? This is really important stuff from an ecological perspective. And we do think about it a lot at the Watershed Council. We have a small specific role that we play in that, but that small specific role ties into a much larger conversation that's happening, not just at the state of Oregon level, but across the country and really across the world, about how we're moving, helping support animal migration and what are the benefits of that for people. Thanks, Rochelle. Thanks, everyone.
All right, and thank you, Andy, for that lovely presentation. And I think, Jason, you are up next. You should be able to share your screen whenever you're ready.
Awesome. All right. Yeah. Thank you, Andy, for kicking us off and getting us underway. Let me see here. Got lots of screen choices.
Yep.
I'm going to try this one and see if you all are seeing the a bright, or not a bright green, but a greenish, unless I'm
Yeah, Jason,
colorblind.
you're coming through.
It's coming through? All right. Okay. Well, yeah, thanks again, Andy, for that, kind of kicking us off and leading us in here and kind of expressing the importance of this work and kind of all the background and things like that. Before we get going, we'll just do a quick round of introductions. I know we already sort of briefly did those, but I think we could just give a bit more context. And so I can kick it off. I'm Jason Smith. I'm the Habitat Restoration Program Manager with CREST, and I've been involved in this project for probably about 4 or 5 years alongside Lauri. Yeah, and so that's kind of a bit of my background, and I'll hand it over to Jay.
Hey, everybody. My name is Jay Horita. I'm one of the project managers for CREST and the person who was on site during construction.
And I'm Lauri Brewster. I am a regional habitat biologist for ODFW and have been involved in this project for the 5 years that I've worked with the agency, and my predecessor was involved with it for probably a decade before I started. So it's a long overdue project.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks for that. And then we're going to kind of split this up. Lauri's going to take the intro and cover kind of the first few slides, and then she's going to hand it over to me to talk about some of the design elements, and then we're going to hand it over to Jay to go show you a lot of fun photos and kind of wrap up how all the construction effort went, and then we'll kind of close it out. Lauri could discuss a bit of the monitoring, and then we'll be open the floor to questions. So with that, I'm going to advance the slide here, and Lauri and Jay, just let me know when you're ready to advance slides, and I'll keep controlling it as we go.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, so I'll just start. Every time I talk about this project, I like to start by saying what an impressive list of partners we have had on this project, and sort of this really highlights the power of partnerships and pulling projects together that are multi-year, several hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars. So obviously CREST and ODFW have been coordinating regularly on this, as well as Bonneville Power Administration, OWEB, Metro, the Willamette Wildlife Mitigation Program, which is within ODFW, the Oregon Conservation and Recreation Fund, Oregon Wildlife Foundation, USGS, West Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District, ODOT, of course, Wolf Water Resources, Consor Engineering, and Portland State University. And we hope there will be others as we continue to monitor and do some outreach about the program or the project. So you can go to the next slide, Jason. So I'm not entirely sure who the audience is here today, so I won't bore you with basic frog biology and ecology, but the target of this underpass project is the northern red-legged frog, which is a federal species of concern. And at the state level, it's a sensitive species. The statewide Oregon Conservation Strategy Plan lists this as one of the species, as well as being one of the top 5 priority species in the entire Willamette Valley ecoregion. So, and getting to a little bit about what you were talking about, Andy, we were able to open the umbrella a little bit beyond the frog, and we do expect other amphibians, reptiles, small mammals to use this underpass, but the focus really was on the northern red-legged frog. Okay, can go to the next slide. So just a little bit of background information here. Sorry for the gruesome photo there with the frog legs. But for several years, ODFW staff have been doing some surveys along Highway 30 between the Wapato Bridge that goes to Sauvie Island and Cornelius Pass, surveying the road shoulders and quantifying the frogs that we find that are dead and the ones that are alive. And then we were able to do an analysis with that data and look at different clusters and hotspots and identify a spot that we thought would be the most bang for our buck in terms of putting in an underpass. And so the hotspots are on the map on the right. There were a couple of them. Other factors that played into this are that another project that CREST completed 2 years ago is a major restoration project on the eastern side of Highway 30 there. And so some of the breeding ground of the frogs has already been restored on that habitat. So this is adding on to that project as well. And so this red line here is the site we identified for the underpass. And a lot of the frogs were following some of these, these channels down the mountains. And this west side of Highway 30 are the Tualatin Hills and Metro-owned property. You can go to the next slide. And if you're not familiar with it, the area to the east of the wildlife underpass is called the Palensky Wildlife Area. It used to be called Burlington Bottoms. And this is a Bonneville Power Administration owned property and managed by ODFW. It's about 460 acres and has a lot of breeding habitat for red-legged frogs. And we have been monitoring egg masses on this property for years. Okay, next slide. Did you want to get into,
Yep.
well, this is where this is kind of nice because this is where we came together and ODFW said, this is what we need. And CREST kind of pulled us back and said, okay, this is what's possible. And we'll work the engineers to see if we can meet all of these parameters. But we basically came with this list based on literature review that any sort of amphibian structure would need to be above the water table and not flooded, because research shows that amphibians will not pass through a tunnel or underpass with moving water in it. and we wanted to mimic the external environment as much as possible. So that meant trying to adjust the humidity, temperature, and external light that would be penetrating the tunnel. And we wanted, a minimum of a foot diameter of the underpass. And again, that's at minimum for these frogs, but the larger, the better. Another important part was that we wanted the underpass to have a natural substrate. Just again, research shows that frogs would be more reluctant to use a substrate, more reluctant to enter and use an underpass if it were, shiny, slick, a non-natural surface. And it was also pretty clear that we would need some directional walls on both sides of the road and both sides of the entrance to the underpass. And we chose the height of that wall based on, how high some frogs can jump and the likeliness of them being able to cross the wall. So that's when ODFW, CREST, ODOT, and engineers all started getting together to see what was actually possible, what it might cost, all of that. So that might bring us into you, Jason.
Yeah, no, that was great. That's a good transition. And so, we get this great list from ODFW to kind of put up the goalpost per se, and then bringing that list to ODOT. Now that was a whole nother factor. And so, ODOT has its own requirements. And obviously, we wanted to come in and do this big, huge wildlife underpass is what we were kind of in go big kind of approach. And ODOT immediately kind of kicked back and said, well, this all sounds good, but we have to think about our responsibilities. And one of the things they first said was that trenchless construction techniques were going to be required instead of a traditional open cut method. And I don't know how familiar folks are with what I'm referring to there, but trenchless means basically we can't open up the highway and like versus, so everything we have to do has to allow traffic to freely flow over the work area. That being said, we're allowed to interrupt, single or 2 lanes at a time, but they had to be minimized in their duration. And a lot of this was important due to this sections of highways, high average annual daily traffic, or AADT. It's 30,489 is the average annual daily traffic. So that's a lot of cars going over this site every day. And so due to that, they required this trenchless construction method. And given the length of the roadway or the width of the roadway, we basically selected the largest diameter casing, and that's 54-inch diameter casing, that we could use a pipe ramming technique, which Jay will show you in some later slides, to punch this casing through or underneath an active highway to minimize interruptions to traffic. And so while we would have liked to have gone bigger, the 54-inch diameter is still exceeding the 1 foot size that ODFW laid out there in their design guidelines. And so, and then this is also just showing these channelizing walls. We did about 600 feet, about 440 feet on this is what we call the east side of the road, and then the west side of the road is the Twalton Hills side. It was about 160 feet. So another element of that design is these channelizing or directional walls. These were designed to funnel wildlife towards this new underpass. They were required to be robust features by ODOT to support or retain the highway road embankment, particularly on the east side. The height requirements, we went with a 3-foot requirement. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but this is the height, and that exceeds, again, ODFW's guidance for it to be 2.5 feet, so frogs can't just jump over. And this lovely diagram shows that, they have this flare on the top, so frogs can't climb over the top of them. But we also wanted to be aware that, the walls that aren't endless. So if frogs were able to get around them, that they still could safely jump off the top down to the substrate below. So that was played into the role of the height of our walls. Other elements included these vertical light shafts, or these 8 light boxes, and those are placed across the roadway. You can see there's 3 off of the shoulder. We had pretty strict limitations by ODOT on the number and location where we could place them in the roadway, so they had to be between the fog line and the shoulder of the road, or in this center median was the only locations. But we tried to maximize as many of these as we could to provide that natural light and ambient air temperature, moisture, and all those things into the crossing. And so these light shafts are equipped with 2 different grates on the top, just for safety, particularly in the roadway. An interesting thing about this project that we didn't really anticipate is, this is the section where the hood to coast comes right through here. So these grates, aside from worrying about cars or motorcyclists or bicyclists, they couldn't protrude from the roadway surface too high, because they could be a tripping hazard, in addition to those other kind of hazardous to bikes, cars, and things like that. So, a lot of considerations went into the design. But we think we did a good job with the number, and we're pretty satisfied with kind of the amount of natural light that these things do provide. Other details here that are shown is that we basically wanted this to have the natural substrate bottom. So it's got this is showing our casing diameter, a kind of cross section of it. And we've got this tremi-poured concrete base to make this nice kind of flat bottom. And then we have this 4 inches of natural substrate bottom, and then there's all these this kind of wood and debris kind of strewn throughout to provide that natural bottom that Jay will show some pictures on a later slide. Another fun thing that I couldn't help myself is the number of permits that went into this, and this isn't the complete list, but this just gives you all an idea of how complex of a project it is, and that even though that there's tons of benefits of the project, to wildlife, it still has to go through a very rigorous permitting and review process. So that was a fun piece of the puzzle that CREST had the pleasure of guiding it through the permit process. But these are all very necessary components of the work we do. So it was a challenge that we were happy to take on, and yeah, but I'm very happy that it's done with now. Now we just have to do all the permit closeout. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jay to kind of show you the fun pieces of the construction effort.
Hey everybody, thanks Jason. Big ups to everybody for hanging in there close to 5 p.m. We won't be too much longer. Please let us know if we need to cut off at a certain point. Time check me anytime, please. But we went through the design, we went through the permitting, we went through a lot of the back ends, and then now we are finally here at the project site, getting everything ready. One of the first things we had to do was to look at how water flowed through the site, where it entered, where it left, and then controlling the water. It was quite a wet season, and one of the very first problems that we encountered on this lovely project, or challenges that we had to overcome, was that the water that was coming into the site was usually dry by the summertime, but a mystery source of water came in and kept the site wet all summer long, straight through to the recent rains. So that was a fun challenge that we had to overcome. Depending on what you're familiar with at construction projects, we just employed a pretty standard set of check dams and hay bales. I'm going to mark up the screen here just to control the flow of water and make sure that anything downstream wasn't being too badly affected. Luckily, we didn't have very sensitive species downstream of this site. If we did, that would definitely would have made things more complicated for this project. So if you are doing something like this in the future, definitely do some homework. Make sure anything downstream is not super sensitive. Jason, is there anything you wanted to add on this slide?
Nope, nothing else. You
Okay.
covered it. The mystery source of water was a leak to an unknown line. Is that correct, Jay? That there was a
Yep.
water line.
Alongside, we as CREST, before the project starts, you try to spend as much time on the project area, but sometimes things are covered with ivy or things are covered with vegetation during the wintertime that's not covered in the summertime or other parts of the year. So we discovered a water line that was on site and was leaking water into the site from somewhere. And it took a long time to find that water leak. But it's just another lesson learned to really spend as much time on the site as possible. None of us represented here are landowners on this project site. If you are a landowner, you're generally a little bit more familiar, but yeah, it was a good lessons learned to spend as much time on the site, preferably walking every square foot of the site before moving into construction season. Next slide, please. You all remember that very interestingly shaped wall that was in the design part? That is this structure right here. It's quite large. When I first saw the wall being built, I was like, this is so overkill to channelize frogs. But it's part of the balance of what each stakeholder wants in the project, what ODFW wants, what ODOT will require or allow, and then what the money and the funding will let us do. This channelizing wall, as you can see, goes all the way to this bank up here, and then it stretches far on either side. At the very ends of the walls, you might be asking, won't the frogs just go around the edge of the wall? Probably, but we thought of that too. And then we put in these side pieces. You'll see them a little bit later to extend the wall a little bit beyond the concrete permanent portion. Next slide, please. Look at all these markings. Okay, here you can see on the left photo a finished picture of the west side wall. You have that end piece right here that we put in a silt fence or some kind of fencing that will extend the wall so that hopefully no frogs can just simply walk around or leap around the wall. You can also see the clearance between the soil and then the top of that flare, the bottom of the wall flare area is something that we had to adjust as we went along, as we had the direction from previous studies to have a 2.5 foot clearance between this area and then the soil. But looking at it, it was a little bit too shallow. We thought frogs would be able to jump that. So along the way, we stayed flexible and we changed design elements. And that was an excellent thing an excellent practice of just staying flexible, even through the construction season. On the right, you can see just the scale of this wall is kind of wild. It's different to see it on a drawing and different to see it from a fancy drone image. Overhead, you can see the west side wall, which is what's being represented on the left. And then the much longer east side wall is just below that in this area right here. Next slide, please. I love that it saves the drawings. We mentioned that the steel casing itself, that's going to be the tunnel to allow frogs to pass through, we weren't able to just simply cut into the road. We had to essentially put a needle through the haystack is a better analogy here. In terms of this is the casing right here. Section by section, we would align it to where it was supposed to go through the road. And then we attached this piston system that would apply a whole lot of force and essentially punch this thing through the wall 10 or 12 feet at a time. We would weld another piece on and then continue with the whole length being, Jason, do you remember what the length was? About
132 feet.
132 feet of solid steel going into the road. During this time, it was quite a loud ordeal. You could feel the earth shaking as the piston was going, and then as a result of that vibration, the road itself began to drop, which was a fun ordeal to deal with. Another challenge to overcome. All of us putting our heads together suddenly, right in the middle of construction, to find a good solution forward and make sure that our activities wasn't going to completely destroy the road and then, as a result, go way over budget on this project. If you're doing any kind of trenchless installment of this casing, keep that in mind. How good is your road? Because a lot of times, people don't know what the road composition might be, what the road prism substrate might be. Those are things to keep in mind and prepare for if you're doing this kind of project. Next slide, please.
Absolutely. The road was built in the 60s, and their construction techniques and the specifications and requirements they had to construct a road with back then were not quite what they are in today's day and age. So trenchless construction methods under a current or new road will work quite well. But what we found out with some of these older roads, even though we did geotechnical investigations, there's quite a bit more voids and gaps in this 60s style construction method. So it did result in some settlement on the east side that we had to address. But other than that, I'll let Jay take it back over.
Yep. So after weeks of pushing this casing, all 100 or so feet of this casing through the road embankment, we were complete. We had to deal with the road settlement, but that came towards the end of the project. So take a look at this right image and keep this in your mind as we transition to the next slide. This is what it looks like currently. This is that same picture that you just saw on the previous slide. Now we have built the walls on both sides of the frog entrance. We also managed to fill in all that soil that we had excavated from the road embankment area. West side, similar deal here. Being able to finish out the casing and the wall was huge, but we also still had the important task of installing the light boxes. So next slide, please. You might be wondering what the heck these light boxes are for. Jason mentioned it. It is very experimental design, but something that turns out makes a big difference. When you're looking through the tunnel from one end, it's pretty dark up until the very end of the other side of the tunnel. But these light boxes are allowing all that light, humidity, to pierce through from the vertical axis, not just the horizontal axis. You can see that we have quite a few of them here, I believe 7 in total. And we also have roadway light boxes as well. So this is right in the middle of the road, the center lane divider. We managed to install some of these without too much trouble. Next slide, please. And this is what it looks like on the east side. This is the same picture. You can see that on the road embankment, there are 2 light boxes that are coming out looking super goofy, but working as designed, and allowing that light to pierce through into our tunnel to light the way for hopefully frogs to come through. Next slide, please. This middle picture kind of shows you a very interesting, these are the light boxes that we were just talking about. They're allowing ambient light to come into the tunnel. Even though the camera might not pick it up, it actually, even in the far reaches of the tunnel, there's quite a bit of light coming through. This takes us to where we are currently. We are taking care of the final 2 tasks here, which kind of stems from other things that have popped up along the way, including one of our roadway light boxes. Jason, if we could backtrack 1 slide. Sorry, 1 more slide, please. Yep. This light box is being flooded out currently because of the heavy rains. There is a drain over there, but it's not working as much as we thought we would. So we have to make a design change and fill this grate with epoxy resin. Essentially, we want to make it an impermeable barrier that allows light through. So we can still keep that light coming through that light box, but not any water. The reason we don't want any water to come in too much is that it washes out all of the substrate, the natural soils that we've installed inside the casing, what will become this material here. So you can see all of that has been washed out. If you look at it now, pretty much all of it has been washed out because of the flooding of one of the light boxes. And we are in that phase right now, plugging it up with a little bit of epoxy resin at my apartment building. It's a good time. I think that is the last slide. Oh,
Yeah, so thanks, Jay, that was great. I will just add too that the inside of the pipe was painted white, and that also made a huge difference in terms of light reflection and lightening up the environment. So next week, we will be installing our monitoring equipment inside the underpass, and we will be using wildlife cameras to capture general wildlife passing through or looking, but deciding not to pass through. And we also have some wildlife cameras that have been modified and attached to a threshold that has an active light trigger. And those are specifically to photograph amphibians and reptiles that are passing through. So we'll start collecting data on that really next week, next weekend, which will give us some time to tweak anything necessary before peak migration, which will probably be in December. So that's it. You can see on the bottom there, that photo, that's a threshold. We were testing different angles and heights for camera placement. So that's actually a red-legged frog right on the threshold.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Thank you all. We might have gone a bit longer than intended. But yeah, here's our contact info if you have questions, or eventually once, some of the rest of the seeds germinate and this, it's not so wet out there, we will be doing some tours and site visits. So feel
That's
free to
wonderful.
let us know.
I do have one question about the light boxes that are through the highway. Is there anything to take into account the possibility of like road runoff impacting the amphibians or any of that, like polluted water quality that could come through those grates?
Yeah, for sure. So we looked at that with the engineers as well, and looking at the direction of flow, if there is any sheeting of water on the highway, and it won't be directed towards those grades. And we also talked about contaminants and possibilities for those getting in, and seemed to all agree that there would be a lot less contaminants in the underpass instead of just walking right across the road, which has how many years of contaminant buildup.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
gonna open the floor up to everyone for questions, and I'm sorry, I think I cut somebody off. Okay, we'll move on. I think Andy has his hand raised. It looks like he may have a question, and then we'll go to Andy's question and we'll open the floor up for questions.
Yeah, just first of all, it's super cool. This is such a cool project. I'm so excited to learn more about it. And I will also say, when I was telling people at the office today, I was doing this presentation, the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council was like talking to CREST and ODFW. Everyone knew about the frog project. Like, it was so cool. So like the local Pew office is like a buzz that we're talking about this tonight. So I just want to give a big shout out, and it is, and just to see your guys' presentation, I'm super jazzed that this is happening so close. Two questions. I'll ask them both, and then other people can ask. But like, we talk a lot about the need to find funding sources, like not just at like the watershed level for projects, but also like these projects are very expensive, and size and things like that matter. So I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about like where the funding for the project is coming from, as much as you can. Like, was it many different sources? Was it a single source? Like, just kind of how you put the package together to do a trenchless corridor underneath Highway 30 while not shutting down the highway. Just absolutely amazing. And then I'm curious, just in terms of like the monitoring and maintenance. It looked like the floor of the crossing very intentionally laid. Are you anticipating needing to maintain that, like go back every few years and make sure things are still there? Or is that just like kind of a thing you'll see what the monitoring tells you need to do there? Oh, Lauri, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. All right, there has to be one on every meeting. So for the substrate, yes, we do anticipate having to add some substrate, maybe change it up a little bit over time as some of the sticks decompose, or some water, or even wildlife kicking some of it out. So it's definitely, there's a lot of adaptive monitoring that will be happening over the next few years for sure. And that's definitely a piece of it. And the short answer to the funding is yes, multiple sources, lots of pieces of the pie, starting out with fish, incidentally. But I'll let Jason speak to that. He's been.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Andy. So again, Lauri kind of introduced the restoration project that happened on the Palensky Wildlife area a couple of years prior to this project, and prior to construction starting for this project. And essentially, that was this huge fish passage project, but it was also, intended to have multi-species benefits for frogs and turtles and all these other things. Well, that I don't want to get in too much in the weeds of the SERP program through Bonneville, but the project scored so high, and the project construction cost for that was quite a bit less than what the score allocated to us for the project. So we were able to convince Bonneville to allow us to investigate the feasibility and begin design for this underpass, and that kind of started it. So that gave us a chunk of funds to begin design. And then we took that and we ran with that, and that's where all the grant applications, the piecing it together began. That was going out to OWEB, ODFW, the different sources that Lauri talked about, bringing in the Oregon Wildlife Foundation, bringing in just really going out to everybody and asking where we could get as much funding as possible. And then unfortunately, you know, as time went on and COVID happened, construction prices doubled. So then we really had to go back to the drawing board again and go back and ask for more funds wherever we could, including pulling in Metro and others, Metro owning the Forest Park and being able to connect to those uplands. But we just really pieced it all together. It was a lot of work, a lot of time, a lot of grant applications, and trying to go wherever we can. We asked ODOT as much as possible how they could help. And they did contribute in various ways. But yeah, it was a lot of basically knocking on the door, asking whoever would be willing to participate in this project. And one thing that also helped is there's going to be 2 more of these that are proposed within this 5.5 mile stretch. So really talking about how, you know, this one project and the monitoring that ODFW is going to be doing going forward on it will really help. So not only the construction, the design lessons learned all there, but the monitoring lessons learned will help contribute to those projects and the success of those ones in the future. So, you know, using all that and all our partners to just try to work together and try to secure all these funds. We were eventually able to do it. It was took a while though.
All right, and it looks like we do have a question from a community member. Caroline, go ahead and ask your question.
Well, thanks for the program and thanks for the project. I am super, super supportive and just really happy to see it completed. I drive Highway 30 once a week and I've been aware of it and just mainly scratching my head and wondering what the heck is going on. And I just think it's fantastic because I do know people who participate in the Harborton Frog Taxi, which seems like the most thankless job in the world, going out on a dark, stormy night and trying to catch slippery, wet frogs in buckets and take them across the road. So I really want to say that now that you've had this amazing learning curve, I'm so excited to hear that you might have 2 more in this 5 miles. I'm of course curious where, but I'm fully supportive. If there's anything I can do, you know, I want to see more wildlife underpasses. I think it's established that it's not just good for wildlife, but it's really good for humans. And having said that, I'm super curious about what kind of critter photos you might come up with. So maybe you could come back in next November or something and give us a first year recap. I would really love to see that. And my question is, I hate to use the word railroad tracks, but I'm just curious about, aren't there railroad tracks? Because I once said to somebody, isn't that amazing? They're tunneling under the railroad tracks too. And then I was told, no, they're not. That's not allowed. So I'm curious what goes on there. And thanks for a great job.
Yeah, no, great question. So the 2 other projects are Crabapple Creek and then the Harborton site. So they're kind of the bookends, and we're kind of tucked in the middle. And then the railroad tracks, you know, is obviously a big piece of the puzzle. But when we're talking about playing the real life game of Frogger, we're talking about crossing a 4-lane highway with 30,000 plus cars, you know, average annual daily. So that's a pretty significant risk to frogs versus the railroad tracks is usually only 3 trains a day. And those are, so, you know, based on what we've seen in terms of mortalities, you're not seeing as many dead frogs on the tracks versus what you're seeing on the roadway and the train. You know, maybe that, I'll let Lauri speak to it, but maybe they can feel the train coming and potentially get away well in advance versus the cars on the highway. You know, they don't create that same effect and trigger to preserve one's life.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Not to mention the piece about the time and cost that would be added if we extended the underpass under the railroad. That was also a consideration.
Thank you. And it looks like we had a comment come in our chat with a question, and it asks, were there earthquake zones and landslide zone surveys done? And then we answered his second question about the railroad tracks.
Um, that's a good question. I think the short answer is in part of the permitting process, there was basically, you know, a brief review done, and it was not likely to impact or not likely to cause a change in terms of earthquake zones and landslides due to the work of the project. ODOT took a lot of consideration into the design of these channelized and directional walls in terms of supporting the whole entire roadway. And they are in very, very robust features. And so that was a reason they required these walls to meet all their standards and specifications to handle things like earthquakes and things like that. And that being said, it's only a 400-foot section of wall. So, you know, we might have one section of roadway still in place, but the rest of it will move.
And it looks like Sophie has her hand up. Go ahead, Sophie, with your question.
Oh, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now? Yes? Okay. I had two questions. My first was, why is the east side wall longer? And my second question is, do you guys have specific success criteria for this project to be able to move forward with the other two underpasses you're hoping to do?
Yeah, so I can jump in if you guys want to, and you can add to it if you want. So I didn't really talk about the breeding ecology of these frogs, but on the east side are the wetland habitats where the frogs migrate to twice a year. And then the uplands are on the west side. And there's a much wider opening. So basically from the underpass extending out into the Palensky Wildlife area, it's a very wide area that the breeding ponds are scattered throughout. And so there's just a lot more, a greater width of movement coming to the road from the wetlands. And then on the east side, there are some the topography has some natural cliffs, and the walls are designed to actually wrap into those cliffs. And then there's that place for extension that Jay showed. So even if there is a small gap, we can extend the wall to hug right up against the cliff. Whereas we weren't going to, knock down any cliffs, and we don't necessarily. There's some anecdotal evidence, but we haven't seen any frogs really jumping from those high cliffs. So it seems like they're funneling into the stream in the lowland before they come to the highway and where the underpass is. So that was the length.
Yeah, and then the other part was about design criteria or something that
if it's successful.
Yeah, success. And so I think I should state that the other two projects we are not actually leading. We are partnering with and help, by sharing designs, lessons learned, and things like that. Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership is leading the Crabapple Creek, and then the Harborton. I'm forgetting what the name of the organization is that's leading that one. But
is that Samara Group?
Yeah, I think so.
Samara Group.
Yeah, and so there's two, so they are leading those forward, but basically we're just sharing lessons learned throughout the design, permitting, and construction, as well as post-construction monitoring, so we can share all that to help, improve their design process, improve their permitting process, improve construction, and then take the lessons learned from the data that Lauri is capturing and hopefully say if these walls need to be taller or something like that, or there needs to be more light or something like that, hopefully we can share that information, and they can use that to better their projects. And Lauri, I think you're also, I don't think we got into it, but wasn't there some talk about maybe having some audio, some like
Yeah, so we have a long list of adaptive management techniques that we could employ down the road. And we're trying to think of this first phase as, looking out 5 years. And so for monitoring, we're basically looking at are the red-legged frogs using it, and what other wildlife is using the underpass? Those are our very broad questions. And if after, it could take a couple of years before we see a lot of traffic through them. We are working with Portland State University, as we mentioned, and there's a master's student right now who's applying for some grant funding to do some pit tagging on the sides of the underpass and through the underpass to do more in-depth monitoring. We've also talked about, like Jason said, adding in any sort of extra lights, auditory cues, more natural substrate, changing the angles leading into the underpass, adding some temporary fencing, even putting some drift fencing out in the wetland areas to help funnel them towards the underpass. So we're not going to rush to say, if this first year we don't capture frogs on the cameras, we are not going to make the conclusion that it's a failure. We know it's going to take a while, and also the cameras aren't perfect. There's, frogs can jump over the laser beam and not activate the camera to trigger, but these are all things that we hope to learn and modify as we go. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah.
And at this point, I wanted to open the floor up. Are there any other questions that anybody would like to ask the group?
I was just going to ask a question. You said you guys meet quarterly and have a forum like this. Is that?
We seem to do at least 2 forums a year. We actually had a turtle and amphibian forum in March. Susan Barnes led some of that, and Jane Hartline, and we had John Hakeem as well presenting, and actually while we were presenting, I was looking to see what area you covered, because we would also love to partner and be a part of some of these things. Our watershed spans the whole of Sauvie Island and those bottomlands all the way through the middle of St. Helens. So we are here to help with any of those grants or letters of support. I can offer grant writing or any sort of assistance in any of this as well. We love the work that you did, and this is amazing.
Thanks for the
Looks like
opportunity
we had a
to
question
share.
come in. Right here. The decoy audio was a question that I had about attracting the frogs. Okay, so that was just a comment. And then what are the estimates of successful round trip migrations over 5 years? And do northern red-legged frogs migrate independently of their parents, or are they taught the migration routes by their parents or community?
Yeah, we believe that there is a learned component, which is another reason we are going to be patient with declaring success. We think it could take some time, teach the information, pass it down through generations, or other subpopulations of frogs in the area. In terms of the actual number, I'm not really, I don't even dare say. When we're out on, an ideal migration night, we're seeing hundreds, if not, 1,000 frogs migrating down in the spring and upwards in the fall. Downhill and around December and then back up in the spring. And we do see actually throughout the duration of the construction process, we were finding mostly juveniles, red-legged frogs hanging out right at the underpass site. And then we would relocate those and, using best judgment in terms of which direction they were heading. But the adults seem to have pretty clear directionality. The juveniles are sort of a little less predictable for their movements.
Thank you, everybody. Give it one last chance. Does anybody else have any questions before we close out the forum for the evening? Well, thank you so much, everybody, Jason and Lauri and Jay and Andy, and this was a wonderful forum. We really appreciate your presentations, and we will be posting this recording on our YouTube site, so we will email you so you're able to share this with other partners and with the general public. We really appreciate you coming to the forum.
Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
Let us know when you want to get out there and look at it.
Yes, we do. We definitely do. We're just talking about that. All right. Well, you guys have a great rest of your evening. Again, you're very appreciated, and have a good night.
Likewise. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks all.
Thank you, everybody. Have a
Super cool.